Let's do this. The Cult of Hockey podcast by the faithful and for the faithful. I'm David Staples of the Edmonton Journal, and I'm here today with Bruce McCurdy. Hey, Bruce.
Hey, David, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good. Kids back at school, so I'm glad. And you're feeling better.
I am feeling better. Yeah, it took a few more days even after I got my test back, but as the second half of this week's gone on, I'm starting to feel myself again, and that was a bug that lasted a good week.
Did
So
your wife's test also come back?
she's still waiting.
Yeah, that's if you have symptoms, I guess.
Yeah,
Like
no, I
they
got
tell you
punched
right
up the
away.
queue. Yep,
If you're
yep.
non-symptomatic, though, you don't find. I mean, I just obviously I think the test is negative. If they had a positive test, she would have heard by now. But I think there's inputting. Like it takes a lot of time to input all that data. I understand. So it takes. I have another friend who's been waiting quite a while, for a test, and he didn't have symptoms either. So I just think if you don't have symptoms, you're at the bottom of the list for hearing back.
Well, they're doing something close to 100,000 tests a week at that one site. So,
Holy
they said
shishkapoli.
1,000 an hour for 12 hours a day. And I can tell you, I stood in a nice long lineup that stretched way across, mind you, spaced apart, of course, but stretched way across this big field, waiting to get in. And they were going fast, like that. The lineup was moving, but there was a lot of people there.
So, Bruce, today in our podcast, we're going to talk about a few things. Right, my current preoccupation is who's going to play with Connor McDavid next year, because I think it may be the number one need. I did a poll on that actually, what the number one need is for the Oilers, and not surprisingly, this is exactly what I was expecting might turn out. Not surprising, there was a three-way tie for the lead, which is not a
Wow.
good sign, right? It means
Not really,
so
no.
the
It's like,
three-way tie was top four D man, which is really code for a number one D man, and then a goalie to compete with Koskinen, and then a winger to play with McDavid. So right across the board, forward, defense, goalie, the fans have identified we have a major need in all areas. The one thing, the third line center was had the least support for being the major need.
and some way that you can make a good case for that one too. I mean, there are needs, and like you say, they are at center, on the wings, on the blue line, and in the net. Other than that, things are fine.
Yeah, I didn't mind Shan last year actually, but I just think when you have Shan and Kara on your roster, that's one too many big slow guys.
Hmm.
And if Kara, Kara's on contract, so if they don't move him, I think if they move Kara, then they might bring back Shan, would be my guess. And that, as a fourth line center, he might be fine. I actually think Gaetan Haas is my dark horse, underrated candidate for third line center. They could do worse, I think. Like I liked his play. I think he's a fast, useful player who's responsible defensively and might actually show something in his second year as the third line center. So I'm not as
Let's
worried.
hope
Like
so.
that might be a stretch. A lot of people might think that's just crazy talk. But do you think that? Like, what do you think? Any chance he could be the guy?
Well, I mean, the Oilers' structure under Tippett and really under Holland, just the way the roster is set up, is they have basically two first lines and two fourth lines. So
Yeah,
they don't have like a traditional third line. They're not going to play the traditional third line role or minutes. Um, so all of Haas and Sheahan and Kara and whoever else they wheeled into that spot were all playing in the bottom. And the bottom six was basically fourth line level in many ways. But Haas, I mean, to me, the most encouraging guys that I think might take a step next year from this year are the two Euros, Haas and Nygaard, that they were just establishing themselves really. And you might say, a pessimist might say, well, they didn't come in and make an impact right away, so at best they're going to be, you know, complementary players, and that's probably true. But I think they can be good complementary players.
I thought Nygaard actually did make an impact. He was, I thought, very responsible defensively, and when he was healthy and going, he was a strong player on the forecheck, on the attack. I really liked his game. So we're going to talk about McDavid's line mates, the goalie situation, the Oilers' weaknesses in procurement in the last decade. We're going to get into a little bit, and we'll also talk about some of these young defensemen making a big name for themselves in the playoffs, and whether the Oilers have anyone on the horizon that can provide that same lift to the team, which is absolutely essential if the Oilers are going to go anywhere, Bruce. So there are a number of major needs here. So I dug in. I'm digging into this thing with McDavid, and I'm starting with the proposition, which I'll get you to comment on. And my proposition is this: McDavid is an extremely difficult player to play with, to mesh with, and it's not going to be necessarily the all-star winger who's going to mesh with McDavid, like even a Taylor Hall, or I would argue Ryan Nugent-Hopkins at the end of the year was playing like an all-star winger. McDavid is an interesting player because A, he's so fast, and B, he absolutely dominates the puck and should dominate the puck. When he's on the ice, the thing you want to see more than anything else in the world is the puck on his stick. And that shouldn't change. I don't think he should change his game. But what he needs then isn't give and go players like Yamamoto and Nugent Hopkins to play with him. Players who flourish in that kind of, I give you the puck, I'm going to get open, you give it back to me. That's a mistake. You're wasting the talent of Ryan Nugent Hopkins playing him, and Leon Draisaitl playing him on some level. You're not getting the optimal, what you can get out of those give and go players, putting them with McDavid. Instead, what he needs are up and down wingers, players who don't need the puck. One of them, I think, should go hard to the net, be that guy who goes hard to the net and comes back hard on the back check. But the other guy, I think, is a one-touch shooter who gets the puck and shoots it. He doesn't need the puck. He doesn't want the puck. He's a guy like Hoffman in Florida. Going back in the day, like the ultimate player in this category was Mike Bossy, who doesn't have the puck on his stick, but suddenly
it's in the net.
It's in the net. And Steve Shutt. Steve Shutt is another example like this, because I'm thinking of similar players to McDavid is Guy Lafleur, Mike Modano. And I don't really know who Modano's line mates. I think Jari Lehtinen was. So a two-way winger. Yeah. So I think that's the two-way winger could work. I don't know Lehtinen's game enough though to comment on it, but I know Lafleur's game was very much like McDavid's game, built on speed, and you wanted the puck on Lafleur's stick. And he played with Steve Shutt, who didn't want the puck at all. He was just there at the net to pop in the goal every single time. Craig Simpson's another player like that who comes to mind. Ryan Smith is the kind of the go hard to the net kind of guy in that vein. And Jacques Lemaire was also with Lafleur, and Jacques Lemaire was just a very smart, incredible offensive talent, but filled in defensively where he needed to. He was the defensive conscience on that line. So I think McDavid needs a guy who is the defensive conscience on the line, and will come back hard on the back check, and he needs that one-touch scorer. So I was looking at the lineup to see in the past, in McDavid's 5 years with the Oilers, who's done well with him, Bruce? Is there anyone on the Oilers who's actually done well? And what we see is that when that Draisaitl, Maroon, McDavid line was together, that line actually did well. And it stopped doing well when they got rid of Maroon, Bruce. It's an outflow of the Milan Lucic decision. They had two players who replicated each other's skill in Maroon and Lucic, but one was tied down in Lucic and Maroon wasn't. And Maroon was clearly the better of the two players, and they couldn't keep him because they'd given so much money to Lucic. At the same time, Draisaitl is almost, when you get rid of Maroon, Draisaitl's play in the last 2 years with McDavid has fallen off considerably. In the last 2 years, McDavid and Draisaitl together, 91 goals for, 80 goals against. So that's a 53% goals for percentage and a huge sample size of ice, 53% goals for percentage. Yeah. That is not nearly good enough to justify playing. The opportunity cost is terrible with that, Bruce. You need at least 60%.
They need to dominate. $21 million bucks. That's a quarter of your salary cap in the two players. They have to be outscoring, and they have to be outscoring by a lot for the idea to keep them together to make any sense at all.
I think with Draisaitl and McDavid on their own lines, at the amount of pay they're getting, you need 60% goals for from the McDavid line. You need 60% goals for from the Draisaitl line. When you have that, the Oilers will be a strong, even strength team. So they even if you had that with them together, that wouldn't be good enough, because you have them together and you need them to lead their own lines essentially. So what we saw with Draisaitl when he was with Nugent Hopkins and Yamamoto was a 77% goals for percentage, 30 goals for, 9 goals against.
Yeah.
Now you're not going to get that right over a full season, but you might get 65% from the Dynamite line. I think 65%, 60 to 65.
60.
The very best lines in the NHL get between 60 and 70%. And so somewhere in there, 60 would be good, obviously. Like I'm just getting greedy here, Bruce.
You're right.
But they need to find wingers for McDavid where he can also get to 60% with a couple wingers. So the one winger, so outside of that Draisaitl Maroon McDavid combination, which for a number of reasons can't exist anymore and it's not going to happen again, there's one guy who when teamed with McDavid, Bruce, on the Oilers, got more than 60% in a substantial amount of ice time. This is not a huge amount, 408 minutes, even strength ice time over a number of seasons. And that name is Jesse Puljujarvi. 24 goals for, 15 goals against, 61.5 goals for percentage, Bruce, when Jesse Puljujarvi. So this is the guy that apparently didn't work out with McDavid. He doesn't have this. He's always getting in McDavid's way, apparently. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't have this hockey IQ to play with McDavid. But he's at 61.5% with McDavid. And guess what? Let's look at Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. He of the high hockey IQ in the last 2 years playing with McDavid. He's at 52% goals for percentage. 23 goals for, 21% against in the same amount of ice time. But the 200 hockey men will tell us, well, let's put Ryan Nugent-Hopkins with McDavid. But no, we can't have Puljujarvi there because he just doesn't have the hockey IQ. The numbers do not support that, Bruce, in any way, in the least. And I'm going to say it's not accurate. And I'm going to say there's a narrative around this, which hasn't, the real narrative, I don't think has ever come out. And I think that there's some bad feeling around Puljujarvi playing with McDavid or Draisaitl, because at that time when he was on the team, McDavid and Draisaitl wanted to play with each other. They were dead set on playing with each other. And when Puljujarvi played with either one of them, that wasn't going to happen because he was the right wing. He was taking Draisaitl's right wing spot with McDavid. And those two star players at that time, they didn't want that to occur. They wanted to play with each other. And I think Puljujarvi kind of got caught up in the meat grinder of their ambition to play together. And so that's my counter narrative to what happened with Puljujarvi. What do you think?
Well, yeah, funny because this year they moved Draisaitl onto the left wing to play with Cassian on the right wing, and that worked out. Leon can play anywhere.
That's true.
So I'm surprised that they didn't try that, but anyway, it never happened. And there was there was a couple of sort of outside smoke signals that maybe the player wasn't fitting in all that well. The one that really grabbed my eye right when it happened was remember in when Las Vegas came into the league in 2017-18, and the Oilers played their first ever game in Las Vegas on McDavid's 21st birthday. And so we can peg that very accurately at January 13th, 2018. And then they had a week off before their next game because they got their mid-season break. And the team scattered I think some of them went to the Caribbean, some of them went to Hawaii. And Jesse Puljujarvi spent his week off in Edmonton in January of 2018. Remember, he was playing street hockey with kids, and there was all this sort of feel-good stuff about Jesse going out there. And at the time, I remember thinking, how in the hell come none of the teammates sort of said, yes, come on with us to Hawaii and have a good time with us. And, we got everything all set. Let's go. And it just, we don't know what's going on inside there. It just, from an outsider's point of view, it seems strange that you had this, this teenage kid that's sort of on the outside looking in while his teammates are going off in different places and taking a mid-season break. And to me, that was sort of just a distant early warning that something wasn't quite right there. And I have no inside knowledge and still don't. I just think it just was a bad sign.
So there's that, Bruce. But we've
Hmm.
also heard numerous comments, I
Hmm.
think, hints, comments, direct comments, insinuations that McDavid and Draisaitl really wanted to play together. Have we not over the years?
Yeah.
I
Oh,
think
yeah.
we've heard it. I think it's been said directly after the fact, but I think Tippett's. All the coaches have talked about it. Everyone's kind of referred to it, and it's they kind
Hmm.
of beat around the bush on it a bit. But I think it has. There's been like 100 hints that they definitely wanted to play together.
Dave Tippett put the end to it, and I thought he made a definitive statement. And this was after they really struggled in December together, and he finally put them on the separate lines. And some reporter said, "How are you going to deal with Connor and Leon? They want to play together, and they like to play together." And said, and Tippett said, "Connor and Leon like winning, and who's going to gainsay that? Certainly not Connor or Leon." And they didn't. And that was kind of the end of the one stacked line approach when they went, as I call it, vertically, put the one superstar on each of two lines. And the Oilers' fortunes basically turned at that point, and it just took a little tough love from the coach. I think that was maybe Tippett's biggest um, obstacle slash accomplishment in 2019-20 was that rejigging of how the Oilers forwards are deployed.
So Puljujarvi this time around, I think he's got. I'm saying there's a chance. First of
Hmm.
all, he'd have to sign here, right?
Right.
So we don't know if that's going to happen or not. But
Right.
if he did, he did have that previous success there. There's also um, McDavid now needs wingers on his team, so he might be looking at Jesse Puljujarvi in a different light. Like the whole frame has changed, where Draisaitl has his line mates. It was a terrible mistake for Tippett to move away from that line in the playoffs. Hopefully, he'll go back to the dynamite line next year because the sum of those players are greater than the parts, and the parts are pretty damn good. So McDavid's going to need some line mates here. This is the fundamental issue they have to solve on their forward lines. Puljujarvi comes in his last year. He wasn't right, Bruce. There you could see he was falling down. He wasn't. His stride wasn't right. He didn't have balance. We now know he needed hip surgery. He had hip surgery. He had a really good year in Finland in the preseason and the early games this year in Finland. He's absolutely crushing it. This is a player who looks a lot more ripe and ready than he did when he was first here, and the situation has changed. So I'd love to see this. I'd love to see them give him
Hmm.
10 games, 5, 10 games. You can actually tell after about 5 games. It doesn't take long to see if players have chemistry. But if they can replicate, Bruce, a 61% goals for percentage in their first 400 minutes together, would that be so bad? Would that be classified as
That'd be
failure
wonderful.
again? Because it's not failure. That's actually success. And
Hmm.
if they can do that, that'd be great. Now, the other line mate, when we look at other players who spend a lot of time with McDavid, Chason's kind of at the bottom of success with McDavid. Cassian didn't have great success either.
And
If you
way
look,
more minutes for Cassian
yeah,
than
if you look
Chase.
at it objectively, yeah, 1,000 minutes and just a 53% goals for percentage. Chase on 371 minutes, 50%. Now, of course, there's other players on the ice at the same time, but we're getting two players together, and I think it's a stat I put a bit of weight in. Put it that way. When we look at the lower time numbers, the smaller sample sizes with McDavid, right at the bottom are players like Archibald. Um, he had a fairly decent goal share, but the shot share when Archibald was on the ice with McDavid is atrocious. It's 40%,
Oh,
and James Neal is just 50%. And they had a terrible goals percentage when Neal's on the ice, just
Neil couldn't
42%.
score.
So I'm not sold on either Archibald or Neal in the end. But there's one player in a very, very small sample size of just 50 minutes. They scored 6 goals, gave up just 2, and had a had a really good shot share of 59%. Um, Joachim Nygaard, Bruce, and Nygaard has the speed to catch up with McDavid, but I just think, and I didn't it didn't really work out with Nygaard on that line, but I think that it's worth a try. And I would say Nygaard, Puljujarvi, and McDavid. I'd love to see that line. That would be my first choice. If they don't bring in anyone else, that's my first choice heading into the season. Nygaard is a very defensively responsible player. And I think you have Puljujarvi and McDavid doing the offense, and Nygaard kind of filling in, and you just say, here's your role, buddy. You're going to play on the top line, but you're going to be the high man, except when it's time to go to the net. You'll dart into the net when you have to. But otherwise, you're first man back on defense. You're the back checker, and he has the speed to do that and the defensive smarts. Puljujarvi also, I think, is a defensively responsible player. I don't know if anyone says he isn't, but that's how I've always seen him. Is he tries to take care of things in the defensive end. So, what do you think of that line?
Oh, well, I certainly don't mind the concept of Nygaard. I think, he has sort of the pieces you like to see. Uh, for one thing, that's speed, which is, as Bill James pointed out in baseball, but it's true in many sports, that speed is a weapon both offensively and defensively.
Yeah.
You use it to close down the other guy on the puck, no matter which zone that puck is or what direction it might be headed at the time. Uh, and he has a history that he's something of a scorer. He was second in the Swedish league in goals this last year there. This guy can put the puck in the net. We didn't see enough of it. Unfortunately, he only played 33 games before he got hurt. I thought he was coming on really nicely in January, and then he got hit by that point shot and broke his hand, and his season was over. And that was just when he was starting to play his best hockey, I think, and starting on a nightly basis. I was starting to notice him positively making an impact, just being, just around the puck a lot and making life miserable for the other team with the tenacity of his checking. So I like him in theory, whether he's got the quality of play to survive in the top six role in the National Hockey League against the caliber of players that he'd be facing. Who knows? And this is where you look at the defensive stats of a guy like him or Gaetan Haas or even Alex Chiasson for that matter, and say, well, look, their defensive stats are far, far superior to the guys in the top six, but they're not. They're definitely playing a lower caliber of opponent as well. So it's kind of apples and oranges, even when you're comparing the same types of stats. So I mean, but I think it's certainly worth a look. And Nygaard, like he's got that year under his belt. He's going to have some time playing in Sweden to start the season to sort of get up to speed. Uh, that's an option that's certainly well worth considering for Dave Tippett. I mean, we had 2 years of watching Zach Cassian playing wing on McDavid's line, and four words that don't belong together in the same sentence are Zach Cassian and defensive conscience. He's not the guy that's going to look after the back checking and and clean up the messes behind other offensive stars. That's just not who he is. So I mean, maybe he's on one wing, but if he is, the other winger better be damn strong on the defensive side of the puck.
I think you want Cassian there for like 10 games a year with McDavid, when you're playing a big physical team or when, you need to send that message in shifts. He should be like the Semenko role with Gretzky. Occasionally you would play there. The thing I like about Nygaard, Bruce, is how he digs in on the forecheck. And I would compare him with Andreas Athanasiou, who didn't have that aspect in his game. Very similar players, and they're both really super fast in that regard. But Nygaard's willingness to battle and to get in there and fight for the puck was vastly outseated Athanasiou, which is my biggest concern about Athanasiou, was he seemed to lack that capacity in his game. Like, just get in there and fight, man. Like, you're so fast, and you're not small, and I didn't see that. I do think Athanasiou and Ennis are also, Tyler Ennis, if he comes back, are candidates, if they come back, to play with McDavid. So in terms of internal candidates, that's how I would rank them. If Puljujarvi comes back, he'd be number one, and then Nygaard number two, Ennis three, and Athanasiou four. So there's four guys, and I don't think all of them will be on the Oilers this year, but just based on their records in the past and the qualities that they have as players, they would be my picks to be the guys you're going to try. I do think they will probably, though, acquire a winger to play with McDavid. So it would be maybe Nygaard, and McDavid and a shooter, or it will be Puljujarvi and McDavid and a guy who goes hard to the net. So that's what my bet will be. Is it will be one of those guys will be the best bet, and then a winger they acquire. But I'm going to dig into that in the future. I mean, look at what Pittsburgh did. They bought in Zucker and who else did they bring in this year? They brought in Jason Zucker and another winger, didn't they? Let me just I'll Google that. Bruce, let's talk a little bit about Darcy Kuemper. What do you think? He's apparently on the market, and what price? What do you think about how hard the Oilers should go after him, and what price would you personally be comfortable paying for Darcy Kuemper?
Yeah, there's rumors that Arizona might be in full fire sale mode. You know, they just got hammered with a ruling by the NHL for testing players outside of the regulations of the draft combine. And the NHL came down super hard on Arizona, took away their second round draft pick from this year and the first round draft pick from next year. And they'd already traded a number of draft picks in the top 3 rounds. In the Taylor Hall trade, for example, they traded away this year's first rounder. And so, as I understand it, at this point, they have 0 picks in the first 3 rounds in either of the next 2 drafts. And they have a lot of payroll. In fact, Cap Friendly currently lists Arizona Coyotes #1 for payroll in the league. And it just astonishes me. You know, the NHL team that's supposed to be bare bones budget and stuff, #1. Like, what the hell is going on there? And so the rumor is that they may be putting up a lot of different guys from their team might be available, and that includes a number of veteran defensemen up to and possibly including Oliver Ekman-Larsson, but also guys like Alex Goligoski and Jason Demers, players of that ilk. And in goal, I mean, I've been looking at this guy Antti Ranta for a while, thinking he'd be a real nice get for the Oilers. But if Kemper's out there, they just signed him. Well, in the fall, they signed him to a 2-year extension that kicks in next season, 4.5 million per. So 2 years left of 4.5, basically identical to Koskinen. So he would be a nice get. And if they're doing the fire sale thing, let's kick the tires and find out. But my guess is that what Arizona is looking for is exactly what Edmonton doesn't have, which is draft picks, because their cupboard has been vacated. And I think if they're trading these guys, you'll see them getting prospects and especially picks back for them, first, second, third round picks to replace the ones they don't have right now. And Edmonton, of course, has already cleared the deck of the next 2 second round picks, one of their next 2 third round picks, one of their next 2 fourth round picks. So they don't have a lot of currency of the exact denomination that the Coyotes are apt to be looking for. So they're, as much as Kuemper might be a match for Edmonton, I'm not sure what you offer Arizona that's a fair exchange that Edmonton has a surfeit of that they can trade from strength.
Well, what about the 14th overall pick this year?
Yeah, for 30-year-old goalie, yeah, that would be a bold move, in the words of Craig McTavish.
Be like the Rolison trade, right? Dwayne Rolison, first round pick.
Yeah, somewhat. When they traded Roley, they had the 3 880 save percentage goalies that were sewering that 2005-06 team. Remember, they had Conklin, Markkanen, and Morrison, and they were all Huey, Dewey, and Louie, I used to call them. And time and again, you'd go to a game and the Oilers would outshoot the other guys 36-25 and lose 4-3, that kind of thing. And finally, they said, we got to get a goalie or this team's going nowhere. Whereas Edmonton right now, they have a goalie. Koskinen's a good goalie. He's not a great goalie, but he's a good goalie. And so to go out and get a Kuemper, now you've got $9 million invested in your goaltending. I think that's sort of your high end that you possibly want to spend on that position. I'd be willing to spend that, but I'm not sure I'd be willing to spend that plus the first round pick because the Oilers have needs at other positions, especially skilled forwards. I mean, then the other option might be use that pick to pick in a young goalie that's going to be around for 10 years. Askarov specifically.
Yeah, NHL scouts not particularly good at identifying goalie talent in drafts, Bruce. I'm I'm
This list of
impacted by
first
those.
rounders is pretty impressive. Most of them worked out, or a lot of them worked out for sure. The real high end guys, they tend to separate, but
All right, maybe it would be okay. Um, so um, my concern about Kemper paying a price for Kemper is that there's a lot of goalies on the market,
mm-hmm.
and again, what you might he's had a couple good years, but
As he ever.
he's been very good. But there's Antti Ranta who played 33 games this year. He had a
Mm-hmm.
921 save percentage, same team. Kemper played 29 games, 928. Now
Right.
Ranta, he's going to come a lot cheaper than
Probably.
he than in terms of a trade than Kemper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'd be thinking, why don't I give up a third or a fourth round pick for Antti Ranta? And he's got 1 year left on a deal that pays him $4 million. Is he going to be that much weaker than Kemper? Kemper's a better bet, that's for sure. But is Ranta, and you have Koskinen, like you're saying. So that's the kind of thinking that might come into play. And there's all
Right.
kinds of there's the whole Vegas situation with Fleury and Robin Leonard. Now the Oilers probably can't afford either of those guys, but there's other goalies. Every time Thatcher Demko makes a save, $25,000 comes off of Jacob Markstrom's contract in Vancouver. Now again, the Oilers probably can't afford him, but there's Thomas Greiss, there's Alex Georgiev in New York, a young goalie. There's Elvis Merzlikins in Columbus. There's Anton Huboden in Dallas. There is Jake Allen, who Montreal just acquired, maybe to flip. There is Matt Murray, who the Oilers are apparently in on, who's coming off a really kind of rancid season, but might get paid. But he's got 2 Stanley Cups and some good seasons behind him, and he's still a young goalie. He's only 26. There's lots of options, and some of them aren't going to cost you a first round draft pick. So, man, that's a pretty pricey. When there's so many other options, and as you say, the need is there, but it's not a kick in the you're not getting kicked in the gut right now. You're just kind of getting slapped in the face. So you don't need to go full out to fill this need, I don't think. So maybe you're right. Maybe that first pick for Kemper doesn't make a ton of sense right now.
Well, not when you're down 4 draft picks in the next 2 years. You do have both your first rounders, but you need to keep them. It's because you got nothing behind them.
Yeah, I think that you're probably right about that, Bruce.
I mean, Kemper, he's, I've been watching him with interest for a long time because he was Red Deer Rebels goalie in 2010-11, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins draft year. And I went to a few Rebels games that year. And he played, I think, all but one of the games. And he was a big man on that team, and it just took him forever in the NHL. Like he made it in 12-13. He made it and played a few games. And then for years he was like a 20 to 30 game a year guy, or a solid backup. And then all of a sudden, the last 3 years, 920, 925, 928. I mean, that's high end stuff. And this year, Arizona, the day he got hurt was the day that Arizona's playoff hopes started to unravel, frankly, and he was out a couple months. And both him and Ranta, really, that's the concern: is are they 100% physically? So
Brian Lawton was saying that he thinks that their numbers are actually not indicative of a strong defense in Arizona, but of superlative goaltending, like just absolutely outstanding goaltending. And I think he's going off Sport Logique data, maybe. I'm not exactly sure where he gets his data from. But he's got some probably insider statistical information that indicates that to him. So that's encouraging to hear. Bruce, there's a lot of young defensemen in these Stanley Cup playoffs who are sparkling. Top of the list, Quinn Hughes. There's Cale Makar. Miro Heiskanen might be top of the list, actually. There's a couple guys. Now, these are all super high draft picks. Similar defensemen in that there's smaller players, absolutely brilliantly skilled players. Obviously, would be a delight if the Oilers had any one of those guys, but they do not. But do the Oilers have, would you say that the Oilers have, in terms of highly mobile puck-moving defensemen on the way up? Are we hopeless, or is there hope that we're going to get some relief in this regard as well? And moving on from our, none of the, except for Nurse, none of the top defensemen on the Oilers are particularly fast. I would say Klefbom's an above average NHL skater. I know some people rate his skating higher than that. I do not. I think he's above average. Larson's below average. Ethan Bear, if he's average, maybe. Larson below, and Nurse is fast,
I'd
somewhat
say Nurse
agile.
Is above average.
Yeah, Nurse is definitely above average. Klefbom arguably above average.
Size.
But they're, for a top four, there's no, they're not. It's a below average overall for skating. So what do you see?
Well, what I see right at this moment, I'm looking at the top of the NHL playoff scoring rolls for defensemen. And here we have Miro Heiskanen, 19 points. Quinn Hughes, 16. Shea Theodore, 15. Cale Makar, 15. John Klingberg, 10. Samuel Girard, 10. All top 6 defensemen are all in the Western Conference. So these are guys that the Oilers specifically are going to have to deal with, most of them for years to come. I think Klingberg's like 27, 28. The other guys are all 25 and younger, and all but Shea Theodore are 22 and younger. I mean, the other night, Cale Makar broke, I think it was Al McGuinness's 1984 record for points in a playoff by a rookie defenseman. And the next night, Quinn Hughes broke Cale Makar's record. And we're going to see, I think, well, depending on who wins the Game 7 today, which one of those guys is going to be the new standard bearer. But holy moly, I mean, they're piling up all these guys a point a game. And very dynamic, exciting players to watch, and it really kind of adds a dimension to the game that the Oilers just don't have. And they don't have anybody resembling a point a game close to it, defenseman. In the system, you've got to think Evan Bouchard has a well-developed offensive game, but he doesn't have the wheels that, say, a Miro Heiskanen has got. On the other hand, Philip Broberg has got the raw tools, but you don't know if he's got the offensive savvy that he's going to be able to bring those tools. I was joking with Low Tide the other day. We were talking about the same topic on my Wednesday radio hit, and I was joking that they should send those two guys off to the island of Dr. Morrow, kind of vivisect them together, and come back with one guy with the legs of Broberg and the upper body of Bouchard, and then you have maybe someone who can compete with Miro Heiskanen's, Cale Makars of the world. My goodness, it's an aching need, and ever more so in the Western Conference, where it seems like the contenders all have high-end, young, emerging defense superstars.
Jonathan Willis did a couple of good posts on this at The Athletic, where he looked at both Broberg and Bouchard in detail at their numbers, and and his question was, can they be a number one defenseman?
Right.
He was very bullish on Bouchard's numbers from his first AHL season, and with Broberg, he said you can't tell because the Swedish scoring numbers are so all over the place that just because he didn't put up a ton of numbers isn't that indicative of anything. But the fact that he actually played a lot of minutes as an 18-year-old in the Swedish league is indicative of players who've got a chance to become a number one defenseman in the NHL. Couple of really good bets there, Bruce. We've both watched Bouchard a lot, and he's more of the Al McInnes school of offensive defenseman. That's the highest end of that, as compared to the Paul Coffey end. He's not that fast a skater. but he really can fire the puck. He can really pass the puck. He's
Mm-hmm.
a very smart offensive hockey player, and I really hope he's on the Edmonton Oilers this year. I know that there's some people, close observers of the Bakersfield team, who don't think he's ready. I disagree with that. I think that, yeah, you're going to give up something on defense, but he's not going to be asked to play in the top four on defense on the Oilers. He's going to be a bottom pairing defenseman, working his way
That's
into the
correct.
lineup,
Yeah.
and maybe on the top power play though. And I think he can. I think he's ready for that kind of role. The other player that I think, and this bothers me, like in the playoffs, the best skating defenseman on the Oilers was on the bench. Caleb Jones, who played 3 pro seasons by then, who's overripe, who's ready to go, wasn't even on the ice for the first couple games, and they chose instead, Matt Benning and Chris Russell. And I like both those players, but I would have in a second inserted Caleb Jones over either of them in the lineup to start the playoffs. And I think it was a mistake, frankly. The NHL game is fast and puck moving, and Jones can play that game much better than Chris Russell or Matt Benning can. And finally, he got in there after Ekman-Larsson got hurt, and he looked really good in his last 2 games. He should have been there from the start, and he should be there. The Oilers, this is the whole thing about moving out one of the top defensemen.
Mm-hmm.
There's a feeling that maybe, I think within the organization even, they're starting to realize maybe Jones is ready, and we can move out one of these top guys and put Caleb Jones in there in his place, get at least as good a player and a more agile player, a faster player. And I'm excited to see that happen, actually. The more I'm watching these playoffs, the more I think it needs to happen. They need to get better skating in their top four. And maybe it'll be as Brian Lawton has said, maybe it'll be 2 guys moving out, and they'll move in 2 guys who can really skate.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it'll be Jones and, let's say, a Tyson Barrie in the top four. So I think that there is reason to hope in the Oilers system that they're going to get substantially faster on defense, and that could happen fairly soon. If you get Jones, a UFA, and Bouchard moves into that lineup, suddenly the puck moving is improved considerably.
Oh, that's for sure. That's a lot of turnover, but I mean, these Jones is, he's within the team already.
Yes.
Bouchard's within the organization already, but Jones, he really made the team in the last couple months of the regular season. And with all hands on deck in the playoffs, he had to wait his turn, but he was really good in games 3 and 4. And Edmonton absolutely dominated possession when he was on the ice. Like I think it was 19 shots to 3 or something when he was out there.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was uh, he showed he was ready in that brief cameo in those 2 playoff games. So, anyways, just as last year, they had to bite the bullet and move on from Andrew Sekera to make room for Ethan Bear, as it turned out. Uh, they're going to have to make some kind of similar move this year. And in a perfect world, I think most people agree that the guy to move on from would be Chris Russell, and that maybe they can find a trade for. I mean, maybe Arizona, if they clear out all those high-priced defenders we were talking about earlier, they'd be happy to take a $4 million defender that they only have to pay 1.5 million in real money to. That would be, a good acquisition for them. That's the kind of fit Edmonton needs to look for. I don't suppose we get Antti Ranta for Russell, but it would be nice to think. But anyway, they've got to make space for these young guys. They need to improve their puck moving, and I think Bear was a good first step, but there needs to be more steps.
What do you think of Ekman-Larsson, Bruce? He's got
7 years left at $8.25 million.
I just think no. Like I'm not. I've seen a lot of him. I've seen a lot of Arizona, and he doesn't strike. He's not in the same class of puck mover as these young defensemen, these electric young defensemen. I don't think he's a vast improvement over Oscar Klefbom. I think he's a better defenseman than Oscar Klefbom, probably. But at that price, I'm just not interested at all. What about you?
Well, that's his 29 to 35-year-old seasons, I believe, and that's you know you get into diminishing returns. And I mean, sometimes if these good skating guys can more or less play forever, I mean, if you were getting Nick Lidstrom's 29 to 35-year-old seasons, you'd be fine with it. I'm like, to me, he's a guy that's uh, kind of taken a step back these last couple of years. And, I think the sort of constant losing in Arizona has maybe gotten to him the same way we've seen some guys in Edmonton sort of become a little bit dispirited. Maybe a change of scenery and a new situation uh, would change things up. On the other hand, he just signed an 8-year contract in Arizona, and maybe he's just happy being a good hockey player in a nice environment, and who knows what makes the motor go. I, from outside, I've been an admirer of the player for a long time, but looking forward 7 years at that ticket, oh boy, you can't get that one wrong.
I'm just going to look up here. I have right in front of me defenseman scoring.
When Nashville traded out to bring in a number of years of PK Subban at $9 million a year, and they wound up regretting that deal after much less time than remained on that contract.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out Ekman-Larsson's even strength scoring this year.
Mm-hmm.
Where it ranked, and my computer is very slow right now. Yeah. There we go. Did I just find it? Ekman-Larsson. He ranked 56th in the NHL for even strength scoring per 60, 1.1 points per game, points per 60, I should say.
Right.
Darnell Nurse, by that same standard, ranked 42nd at 1.2 points per game. So that doesn't scream out D-man who should earn $8 million a year, just like our Darnell Nurse doesn't, even with all he brings, doesn't scream out $8 million a year defender to me either.
Right.
I think they can do, it's just too much money, Bruce, like for that cap hit. And I actually don't think the Oilers would be considering it at all.
Well, they just haven't got the room, David. I mean,
yeah.
I guess if you put him and Caleb Jones together, they would cost the same money as your pairing of, say, Nurse and Larson would. But you're really hamstringing yourself with a big contract like that, especially, like I say, 7 years to go. And we've seen the Oilers make too many mistakes on long-term big money contracts in the past. I, for one, am pretty wary of them.
Yeah. Bruce, let's look at, finally, Oilers procurement. And you did a little comparison to Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay seems to have a real knack at finding players in the later rounds of the draft, finding players in free agency, especially young players, unsigned juniors and such. And the Oilers, not so much. Not so much.
Yeah, I watched quite a bit of the Tampa series, both against Columbus and Boston. And those are two pretty tough teams that they beat, and they polished them both off in 5 games. And the more I watched Tampa, the more I thought, holy moly, have they ever done a good job putting this team together. And they did a smart job last year not panicking after the playoff collapse of 2019. And they kept most of the core pieces together. And I just looked at how did they procure the players? How does that compare to how Edmonton did? And I wrote a post about that. And Tampa, they're coming in away from the same place that the Oilers did a little bit earlier, but they were the dregs of the league around 2008. In fact, they had the first overall draft pick that year, and they used it on Steven Stamkos. And the next year, they had the second overall pick, and they used it on Victor Hedman. And that was, that's kind of been their axis of power ever since. The great forward, the great defenseman. And of course, Stamkos, we haven't even seen him in the playoffs. I'm not sure we will see him in the playoffs, but the team is so deep that they're still a great team without that guy. And otherwise, their first round picks, from 2010 on, which is when Steve Yzerman came in with his assistant Julien Brisebois, who's now the full-time GM in Tampa. So they've had a consistent management team for 10 years. And they only have one more first round pick from that time that's on their team, Andrei Vasilevsky, the superstar goalie. They targeted a goalie, In 2012, they targeted the right goalie, problem solved. And now they've got their goalie going forward. Uh, but where they've aced it, absolutely aced it, is on the second day of the draft, the Saturday when they do the rounds 2 through 7, and they got their forward ranks just uh, great depth, all lines of the team, forwards, dating back to Alex Killorn, drafted in 2007, who's still a very polished two-way, middle six kind of player, great penalty killer. They got superstar Nikita Kucherov, 58th overall. They got superstar Braden Point, 79th overall. They got Selke trophy, future Selke trophy winner, possibly Anthony Cirelli, 72nd overall. Killorn, 77th overall. Grinding depth forward Cedric Paquette, 101st overall. And here's my favorite, Andre Palat, the guy that's been filling the net with huge goals for Tampa in the playoffs, 208th overall in 2011. And then outside of that, they found on the scrap heap of guys that were never drafted, that came up through the junior ranks and didn't even get drafted, Tyler Johnson and Yanni Gourde, who both went on to become 60-point players in the NHL for Tampa Bay Lightning that they just found and signed, no acquisition cost at all. And you compare
Ouch.
that, yeah, you compare that to what the Oilers have, and what you see with the Oilers is top heavy. Of course, they've had in the last 13 years 11 picks in the top 10. So you would expect them to have a lot of high-end talent, for not first overalls, of course. And so you've got Nugent Hopkins, McDavid, Draisaitl, Nurse, Clefbaum, all first-round draft choices. And that is the core of the team. And you can look at that and say, well, that's great scouting on behalf of the Oilers. You can say, well, geez, they had those high draft picks. They should have some good players, and they do. And when you look past that, I mean, Kailer Yamamoto is the other first rounder that's currently making a mark on the team, and he's a good player, and he could become a core player. It's a little too early to call him that. Rounds 2 through 7, all they've gotten in all these years, well, until this year, they had only Jujar Kara, right? Who is, on his best day, he's Cedric Paquette, right?
Yeah.
And uh, and then this year, finally, they added a couple of guys that when you're talking about day 2 of the draft, you're talking about typically 3 to 5 year projects. You're not talking about guys that are going to step in and make the team. You're going to have to send them back a couple of years. You're going to develop them in your farm team. This year, finally, a guy we were just talking about, Caleb Jones, and of course, Ethan Bear, that were mid-round draft picks that are finally, players coming up from within the system. But in the meantime, you have Tampa that's had, these same guys that have been kind of the core players on their team for years. And Edmonton, you know, they they keep going outside the organization and try and find the solution elsewhere, and on the UFA market, on the trade market, on the waiver wire, you name it. But uh, it hasn't. It hasn't borne much success, and there's a lot of mistakes that have happened that have kind of crippled their salary cap structure as well. So there's uh, by way of comparison between Edmonton Oilers and Tampa Bay Lightning, there's basically none. I mean, the only thing they have in common, and this, I'll take a little encouragement from this. Steve Eisenman learned at the knee of Ken Holland, and Ken Holland, in his 1 year on the job here in Edmonton, has shown some of those same tendencies to want to grow and build his team from inside, and to be patient with the players that he's got, and to bring up the players that he's got. But one of the things that really struck me about Tampa, by the way, is that they haven't got a single expensive UFA on the team. Like, they signed their own guys, like Stamkos. They signed him when he was, his time was up, but they never brought in. They never went after a Tavares or let alone a Lucic or anything. When they had money to spend, they spent it on their own players, and they've got this sort of internal competition for salaries. Whereas
Yeah,
Edmonton went out
smart.
and they bought Benoit Pouliot, and they bought Andrei Sekera, and they bought Milan Lucic. You look at
Mark
Edmonton's roster
Fane.
today; those guys are gone. But guess what? They're still paying for them because they got buyouts, they got cap retention, they got and or guys that they got back that have bad contracts. You can go through. There's a litany of things that went wrong with the attempted shortcuts. And it just lays bare the shortcomings, I think, of Edmonton's management approach over the years, compared with the consistent uh, approach of Eiserman and Brisebois down there in Tampa Bay. I haven't got a
Bruce,
cup to show for it yet, but I think that might be coming very soon.
yeah. But Benoit Pouliot pushed the river, Bruce. He pushed the river. Tyson Barrie had 1.2 points per game this year. Oliver Ekman-Larsson, 1 per 60. Oliver Ekman-Larsson, 1.1 per 60. If you're going to go get a defenseman on the market, Tyson Barrie, he's not going to be 8 years or 7 more years at $8 million, and he outscored Ekman-Larsson this year. Now, you could say Ekman-Larsson is a better defensive defenseman than Tyson Barrie, and I don't know. I can't tell you about that. But if you want someone who's going to put up points, Tyson Barrie is a better bet than Ekman-Larsson. And I keep coming back to him. There's other D-men out there as well, and we'll see what happens. But the Oilers have got that. To me, the more I think about it, Bruce, I think that's where you're going to want to spend some money this year. I think you make a compelling argument in that they have Koskinen. They just need someone to play with them. They don't need someone who earns dramatically more than him. At forward, they've got internal candidates in Puljujarvi if they sign him, and other guys. And I think you can bring in a smaller contract who's going to work well with McDavid. But if you're going to spend some money, and I think they can move out some money on defense and bring in a good guy. So, and as for the Tampa Oilers comparison, I just got increasingly depressed as you went through that litany of. And the one thing that cheered me up was the name of Ethan Bear. Like, it makes such a difference if you hit on one of these low round picks. It's so huge for your team. And if Jones works out, and he will work out, I think if both those guys, that will be so huge for the Oilers, Bruce, to have that happen on this team finally. And then if some of these other guys, like if Tyler Benson can come through, or if Ryan McLeod can, or some of these guys, or Kirill Maximov can still come through, or Dmitry Samorukov, that is going to be huge for the Oilers. So fingers crossed on those.
Well, that's what Tampa's been delivering, and they got so much internal competition. They got a good young forward like Matthew Joseph, who's been pushed off the team because he's been beaten out by other guys. He wound up in the minors this year, and he's got another draft pick that's got like 100 NHL games under his belt. And in Edmonton, we're not seeing that. So, and here's a depressing fact for you. If Matt Benning was on Tampa Bay Lightning, he'd be the third highest paid defenseman on the team. On the Oilers, he's the 7th highest paid defenseman on the team. I'm actually going to write more about this because I think there's enough here on sort of the cap management side of things to make for a second post in this comparison. Depressing as some of these details are, I think it's an eye opener and worth pursuing. So that's what I'm working on today. But it's. Let's shake your head territory for oil country.
I think the little bit of good news is that under Chiarelli, the drafting and the development system got better. I think that's just undeniable. There were some decent drafts there. The one that brought Bear and Jones, and certainly one of them, and Yamamoto was a good pick. And some of these other guys look like they're trending in the right direction. So maybe now the key is Ken Holland building on that. Has he brought in the right people around him to bring in draft well and procure the right pro players? Now the trade deadline, with Athanasiou Mike Green coming in,
from Detroit, the same place
it's
that Archie Henderson came in from, and Colin himself came in from. Yeah.
it's a little bit depressing, Bruce. And Tyler Wright's draft record, um, he had a chance to draft Quinn Hughes in Detroit. They took Philip Zadina instead. So,
Ooh.
Tyler Wright's draft record in Detroit doesn't inspire. I'm going to look in it. I did a post on it last year. There's another year that's gone by. So we
Mm-hmm.
have that much more information, but
Right.
the early returns aren't inspiring a whole ton of confidence. And I just want to look into it a little bit more deeply before I speak to that. But that first trade deadline didn't really work out for the Oilers. They didn't identify players who they paid a lot for Athanasiou, and he failed them in the playoffs. So we'll see, Bruce.
Yeah, well, that's where those 4 draft picks went. That they're down in the
Yeah,
next 2 drafts. It's in bringing in those guys. So they invested in them, and they didn't get a lot out of them in 2020. So
So
yeah,
maybe we'll see with that. We'll see what happens. It's interesting what's going to happen with Athanasiou. I mean, if they don't re-up him and they can't trade him, then they lose him for nothing. You, it's you'd hope that they could trade him for a second round draft pick, but that's going to be for a team that's willing to pay $3 million to re-up him at that price. Maybe there is a team out there that will do that, but I'm not sure that there is. Bruce, let's leave it there. Unless you have something positive, like anything positive, rather than ending on
uh,
that low note.
well, like I say, my one positive I took away from that was that with their current experienced management, that Edmonton may have turned a corner with those with their strategy towards young players. That said, same manager traded 4 draft picks for immediate help, right? So he's kind of trying to balance and to compete now and for the future. He did not trade away any of the first rounders. So whereas Tampa, on a different stage of the cycle altogether, traded the 2 first rounders they had for a couple of useful role players because they want to win now. I mean, now obviously their window is open right now,
Yeah.
2020. So,
And, and over the years, they also traded for veteran D-men, and
mhm.
they did sign one guy. What was his name? O'Callahan? Was that it? Ryan
Oh, Brian Callahan, they
Ryan
traded for. They
Callahan.
traded for. They. Oh, sorry, they traded Brian Callahan, but they brought in by trade Ryan McDonough. He's the big shot they acquired by trade. But they got 3 veteran D-men relatively dirt cheap as unrestricted free agents: Kevin Shattenkirk, Zach Bogosian, and Luke Shen. And they got like 2,000 games between them or something like that. They've been around, seems like forever. And they were all coming off of big contracts elsewhere, and Tampa got them on the rebound. I mean, Shattenkirk was bought out. Zach Bogosian, his contract was terminated, and they were looking for a soft landing place, and Tampa was very happy to accommodate them. And
No, yeah,
so
and
just some
it's
sharp man. I don't think Oilers had a shot at those guys. I mean, let's be fair. But there's just some really sharp practices going on there, and I admire. I tip my hat to Julian Breezeball. That guy really knows what he's doing.
yeah. My point with Callahan was they they did trade. They
They
earlier on
moved
they
him
traded.
away to get rid of his
No,
contract.
but
Yeah.
earlier on in the cycle, like you said, they never brought in an expensive free agent. Now they
Oh.
did trade for him, and they signed him then, I think, for a huge contract, right? Like I think when he was a
Mm-hmm.
UFA or heading towards UFA. So they did do that
Mm-hmm.
with Callahan and lived to regret it, I think. Although he had one good playoff year with them, but or a decent playoff run with them, but he was a player who,
Yeah.
an Oiler type signing, an Oiler type move was the Callahan move. So they did make some mistakes along the way,
Mm-hmm.
but
Oh yeah, nobody's perfect. I mean, sure, you could look at a couple of their contracts that they've signed and say that's a bit of an overpay for that player, but they got more cap room than Edmonton does, and they're 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 in tight for 1 in 4 chance of winning the cup, and I'd put their odds at better than that.
they brought in Strawman, like they signed a free agent in Strawman, and that worked out, right?
Hmm.
Back in the day. Boy, did they ever make
But then they let them go, and they found cheaper
they ever
alternatives.
make a good trade with Montreal though, bringing in Sergachev for Duran? I mean, they just totally fleeced Montreal. What a disastrous trade. Hey, there's an
Okay, and
upside.
there's my positive is that what Steve Eisenman did with Drouin is very similar to how Ken Holland is playing Puljujarvi. To say, I got the cards, you come to me and we'll work it out. And in that case, Drouin had to come back to Tampa. He played a year, he played a good year, and then he became a tradable commodity. And Eisenman played his hand perfectly and got Montreal to bite on the young French Canadian dynamics offensive guy, and they got a huge return in Sergachev and a second round pick.
Yeah, I can see why they wouldn't want to trade Puljujarvi for a second round pick. Like, what's the upside for us? I mean,
Right.
we can get a lot more. Like, there's a much more upside you coming back. So, all right. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for talking today.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone.
And in the meantime, and in between times, this has been another edition of the Cult of Hockey podcast.